Understood. Here is the translation only. Amid the quiet hills of Bel Air, where the winding roads soften under the shade of old trees, there is a house whose curtains are always half drawn. People say that inside Jack Nicholson, the face that illuminated Hollywood for nearly half a century, is living the slowest days of his life. No more red carpets, no more cameras, no more those wide smiles that the whole world remembers. Only an old man sitting and looking at the city he once ruled, with eyes no longer as sharp as before, yet still holding the mystery that makes him unforgettable. There was a time when his name alone could silence an entire hall, a figure who stepped out of the screen to become a real-life icon. A smile that could be humorous, threatening, or a confession that behind it lay more than anyone imagined. That is what made Jack Nicholson special. You never knew when he was acting and when he was real. And perhaps he no longer knew either. For decades, Hollywood assigned him dozens of faces: the madman, the rebel, the stubborn detective, the deranged genius, the man who belonged to no mold. But behind all of them, there was always a quiet question that followed him like his own shadow. What is Jack Nicholson's true face? The world once saw him in the brightest light. A white screen lit up, and Jack appeared with his eyes narrowed mischievously, his crooked smile suggesting he knew a secret the rest of humanity had overlooked. His allure was unlike that of a traditional star. It was wilder, more unpredictable, and so honest that viewers felt as if they were looking straight into the soul of a completely exposed man. Yet the irony was, the more authentic he was in his roles, the better he hid his real life. And then, as the years went by, the lights slowly dimmed. In the 2010s, he disappeared from Hollywood quietly, as if the stage had closed and he no longer had a reason to step onto it. Only occasionally did people find him courtside at Lakers games. Messy hair, familiar dark glasses, the same slightly tilted posture. Sunlight touched his aging face, and in that moment, we saw again the smile that once baffled the world, the smile of a man who had worn so many masks that no one knew who he was without them. That is why Jack Nicholson's story has never simply been the story of a great actor. It is the journey of a man who lived through the lies of childhood, the roles that built his legend, the loves that never stayed, the years filled with laughter and shadows, and finally, the silence of old age. A silence so deep that we ask ourselves, perhaps this is the true face he kept only for himself. Because if life is a stage, Jack Nicholson lived like someone who never stopped changing masks. Each mask shone brilliantly, made us believe, fear, feel. But which one was his? Perhaps only when the lights go out can we see that truth clearly. And the journey to find the face behind the smile of Jack Nicholson is where this story begins. Jack Nicholson was born on April 22, 1937 in Neptune City, a small seaside town in New Jersey, where old wooden houses were constantly brushed by the Atlantic winds, as if wiping away the traces of every story. But it was in that seemingly peaceful place that the greatest secret of his life was hidden, a secret he lived with for nearly 4 decades without ever knowing. His biological mother, June Nicholson, was only 17 when she gave birth to Jack. A young, beautiful dancer, living wildly, carrying within her the dream of the stage. The father, Donald Furcillo, a performer and acrobat, appeared briefly and disappeared from their lives, before Jack even opened his eyes to the world. No one knew where he went. They only knew his footsteps faded from the family's memory, as if he had never existed. In that situation, Jack's grandmother, Ethel May, decided to raise him and told the boy that June was her sister. A short sentence, yet enough to alter an entire understanding of one's origins and identity. Jack grew up in a house with 3 women: his grandmother, his mother, and his aunt. But none of them were truly a mother in the sense he could name. Neighbors often said, "That boy is strangely independent." They didn't know that behind that independence was a silence that had no words. In the 1940s, Neptune City was not a place for big dreams. Jack went to Neptune High, a small public school, where teachers described him in one sentence: smart, but unruly. He excelled in subjects requiring imagination, quick in reaction, yet unable to accept conformity or authority. Sometimes he rebelled simply to prove that he existed in his own way. A natural response from a child who had no answer for his true identity. At school, he laughed often, but with a kind of laugh that left people unsettled. A mischievous smile, part challenge, part arrogance, as if he were hiding a truth no one else could reach. Someone once said Jack used to stand in front of the mirror in the old bathroom, practicing different expressions: anger, madness, joy, cunning, coldness, as if trying to find his real face among countless invented ones. He didn't know he was laying the foundation for one of the most formidable acting abilities of the 20th century. And he didn't understand why he had to do it. Perhaps, deep inside, Jack sensed the emptiness of his identity long before anyone told him anything. Everything unraveled in 1974, when Jack was 37, already famous in Hollywood, already an easy rider in Chinatown. Time magazine, while investigating his background for a profile, uncovered the truth. The woman Jack called his sister was in fact his mother, and the woman he called mother was his grandmother. When a reporter handed him the documents, Jack simply went silent. No anger, no complaints, no questions. He just withdrew from the world for months, as if the pieces of his life had been scattered and rearranged once again. Later, in a rare interview, he admitted softly, "I lived half my life with a story that wasn't true. But maybe that's why I acted more truthfully." And that sentence is the key to Jack Nicholson's deepest essence. To survive in a world without truth, he had to learn how to create his own truth. On stage, in every role, in every glance that made audiences believe in the person standing before them. Jack's childhood had no grand tragedies, no crushing poverty, no resounding catastrophe. But it was the quiet emptiness that became the longest fracture. A childhood of modest means, full of unease, growing up in a house where everyone played a role, everyone hid something, and a boy who never knew he was living in a play crafted by the very people he loved most. That was where his first mask was formed, not to deceive others, but to protect himself. And from that child, one of the greatest actors of the 20th century was born out of a secret. Jack Nicholson's story begins right there, where truth was concealed, and a child had to search for his real face among the many faces others had handed him. In 1954, at 17, Jack Nicholson left Neptune City for Los Angeles with a bold decision no one in his family truly understood. He only said briefly, "I want to do something bigger." No money, no plan, and no one waiting for him at the other end of the country. But Jack carried with him something he had always possessed since childhood, a strong instinct that his life could not simply drift away in a small town. Los Angeles at that time was a land of dreamers and drifters, dusty roads, studios filled with heat, and casting notices scattered everywhere. Jack found a small job at MGM, not as an actor, but as an office worker. The skinny boy with messy hair was often rushing around carrying papers from room to room. But what people noticed most were his eyes. They were too bright, as if he wasn't working there just because he needed the money. He was watching, learning, absorbing every movement of a world he longed to step into. Not long after, Jack began attending evening acting classes. He took extra roles, supporting roles, nameless roles. He joined small theater troupes, rehearsing with unknown but passionate actors. And during that period, he met Roger Corman, the man known as the King of B-movies. Then one day, during a small script reading for an independent film group, Roger Corman saw Jack. There was no brilliant moment, no fated light. Corman simply looked at him a few seconds longer than he looked at anyone else. An assistant next to him said, "There's something strange about that kid." Corman nodded. Strange is good. And so Jack was invited to audition for the Cry-Baby Killer. When asked whether he could play a young man pushed to the edge, Jack raised his eyebrows. "I lived like that for most of my youth. Just turn on the camera." The Cry-Baby Killer, 1958, was Jack's first lead role in a feature film. The movie was a complete failure. No one noticed him, but something interesting happened. Even though the film wasn't well received, some young filmmakers were drawn to Jack's strange expressions, what they described as, in some way, too real. After that film, Jack continued moving through Corman's world of B-movies, films shot quickly, cheaply, and rarely mentioned again. But for Jack, each small role was a laboratory. He tested his voice, his gaze, his madness, his vulnerability. He didn't need an audience. He was searching for the face that fit his soul, the one he had never been certain of since childhood. In the 1960s, Jack's career was so stagnant that he once said, "I didn't know if I was an actor or just a stubborn guy clinging to an outdated dream." During that time, he even thought he was better suited to screenwriting. In fact, Jack wrote the script for The Trip, 1967, and several other films with Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda. But whether writing or standing in front of the camera, Jack still felt he hadn't found the right path. He was missing something, a role that could unlock his true nature. Around that time, Jack met Sandra Knight. Their love quickly turned into marriage. Sandra was one of the few who saw the vulnerability beneath Jack's tough exterior. But the insecurity he carried since childhood was not easily erased. Sandra said there were nights when Jack stood alone in front of the mirror, practicing expressions in silence, as if trying to see who he was that day. "You live like you're always preparing for a role," Sandra said, "even in your own home." Even when Jennifer, their daughter, was born, Sandra once saw Jack standing silently for minutes by the baby's cradle, not speaking, not smiling, just looking. Then he sighed softly. "I love her so much, I'm afraid I'm not worthy." The marriage lasted less than 5 years, 1963-1968. Sandra left with a gentle remark that felt like a prophecy. "You were born to belong to the screen, not to anyone." Jack continued with small roles, self-written scripts, extra acting classes at night. But then, As the 60s shifted into Hollywood's most chaotic period, the door of fate opened. In 1969, when Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda were working on a small film called Easy Rider, they had someone else in mind for the role of George Hansen. When that person turned it down, Hopper said, "Call Jack. He's got something strange." No one on the crew at the time thought Easy Rider would create a cultural shockwave, and even less that Nicholson's small role would change the entirety of American cinema in the 1970s. But before becoming an icon, Jack was just an actor teetering on the brink of failure. He had played bizarre roles in Corman's B-movies: a flower seller, a bellboy, a possessed man, roles that needed a face, not depth. But those years, those fragmented roles, those little-watched movies, gave Jack a special skill: the ability to turn any character into a living human being, even if he appeared for only a few minutes on screen. Jack once said, "I had no money, no opportunity, no one pushing me forward. But I had this. I believed I knew many different faces of humanity, because I had lived with many faces since I was a child." And that was the foundation of The Man of Masks. An actor who could slide from joy to sorrow, from clarity to madness, from sincerity to threat in a single blink. An actor audiences could never tell what was real and what was performance, because Jack had learned to live that way since childhood. By the late 60s, as Easy Rider emerged and a new Hollywood was about to awaken, Jack Nicholson had reached the final edge of failure. But it was at that very edge that a great door opened. The door that would lead him to the brightest spotlight of the new Hollywood era. And it all started with the first mask. The mask Jack wore to survive, before he turned it into art. When the Easy Rider crew called Jack Nicholson to replace an actor who had dropped out at the last minute, no one, not even Jack, thought it would be the moment that changed the fate of American cinema. The film was just a small, low-budget, rushed project aimed at a rebellious youth audience of the era. But sometimes, history doesn't need a grand doorway. It only needs the right person at the right time. On the first day of shooting, Hopper wanted the character George Hansen to be genuinely unsteady, so he handed Jack a real bottle of whiskey before the scene. Jack drank so much that the scene became a chaotic mess of drunkenness. Yet it was breathtakingly alive. Hopper had to shoot it nearly half a dozen times, piecing together whatever footage was usable because Jack was too drunk. But when they watched it back, Hopper sighed and said the famous line, "The first time I've seen someone act even better drunk than sober." Jack just laughed. "I wasn't acting. I was just trying to hear what you were saying." The role of George Hansen in Easy Rider earned Jack Nicholson his first Oscar nomination. And more importantly, it showed Hollywood what audiences had never clearly seen before. Jack didn't just have many faces. Each face was so real, it disarmed the viewer. From that moment, major films began seeking him out, as though realizing they had overlooked something for far too long. After Easy Rider, Jack began to be in demand. The new directors of the 1970s, the new Hollywood generation, didn't need a flawless star. They needed a raw soul, full of scars, carrying the face of someone who had wandered through life lost in himself. And they found that in Jack. 5 easy pieces arrived like a declaration. Jack became Bobby Dupea, a man who rejects family, past, and stability. A man standing between two lives, unsure where he belongs. The scene where Bobby sits in a diner, trying to order food with no rules, became the emblem of an entire generation of young Americans who felt trapped in their own existence. Director Bob Rafelson said Jack didn't perform that scene according to the script. He just did what he felt. Jack almost never memorized his lines fully. He learned about 70%, the rest he left to instinct. That's why scenes that seemed ordinary suddenly felt too real. Every frown, every clipped sentence carried a piece of Jack himself, his inner instability, his refusal to conform, and his constant search for the real face beneath the mask. The wild rhythm didn't stop. By the last detail, 1973, Jack became the Navy lifer who cursed so much the censors held emergency meetings. But behind the loud exterior was a character so lonely he could only show kindness through abrasive words. Audiences laughed and hurt at the same time. And with each role, Jack Nicholson did something very few actors could. He made imperfection beautiful. But it wasn't until Chinatown, 1974, that his face truly merged with the darkness of a story that transcended noir. As Detective Jake Gittes, Jack didn't bring his signature sharp smile, but the weariness of a man betrayed by a world he thought he understood. In one scene, Polanski walked up close, looked straight into Jack's eyes, and whispered, "You're acting like a star. I want you to act like a wounded man." Jack didn't reply. He looked down for a few seconds. When the camera rolled again, his face changed completely. Exhausted, sharp, but trembling beneath the surface. Polanski smiled. "That's the face I want. The face without a mask." In another scene, Gittes gets his nose slashed. The knife was dulled, but when Polanski, who played the thug, brought it close, a slightly rough motion actually cut Jack's skin. Blood came out. The crew panicked. Jack squinted, touched the wound, then burst out laughing. "Keep it. It suits me, doesn't it?" That accidental cut became one of the film's iconic details, adding to the realness Jack always carried. Roman Polanski once said, "No one looks at life with eyes both suspicious and sincere the way Jack does." That sentence alone explains why Jack was the soul of New Hollywood, an era of truth, not perfection. But all of that was still just the prelude to the greatest chapter. In 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest arrived like an artistic storm. The role of Randall McMurphy, the man who rebels against the system inside a mental institution, was not just a performance by Jack. It felt as if he stepped onto the screen with all the turmoil and irregularities of his own life. When he shouted, provoked, rebelled, people saw the chaos of Jack's youth. When he silently watched the patients crushed by authority, people saw the fear of being suppressed that haunted his childhood. When he smiled, it was the smile of a man who had worn too many masks to protect himself. After filming ended, Jack said a line that felt like a confession. "McMurphy is me, someone who fights every mold." His first Oscar didn't come as a reward, but as confirmation. Jack Nicholson had become the face of an era that shattered the image of the perfect movie star and made room for flawed characters, people who looked more like us. And so, in just 6 years, Jack went from a vague kid behind MGM's offices to the icon of a new cinematic movement. But the most important thing wasn't the titles or the statues. The important thing was this. By this stage, the mask Nicholson had worn since youth was no longer a mask. It had become the true face the world saw. Brilliant, chaotic, full of energy and full of wounds. A face American cinema had been waiting for. When the 1970s entered their latter half, Jack Nicholson was in a position any actor would dream of. Fame poured down on him like the blinding glow of a projector light. Major directors fought to write scripts just for a chance to cast him. But it was precisely then that Jack stepped into a more chaotic era. One where light and darkness blended so completely that no one could tell where performance ended and real life began. Hollywood between 1976 and 1980 was like a party that never stopped. Young stars were swept into storms of cocaine, hard liquor, affairs, and paranoia. Jack stood right at the center of that vortex, both the one keeping rhythm on the dance floor and the one observing from the outside. He was invited to every party, worshipped as one of the icons of the era, but also became a familiar face in sleepless nights where the line between freedom and loneliness was as thin as breath. In those long nights, one woman stepped into Jack's life and stayed for a very long time, Anjelica Huston, daughter of director John Huston, raised among art yet never overshadowed by anyone. When they met, both were drawn to the wild electricity in the other, like two wires crossing, sparking, and tangling in ways that couldn't be undone. Their love lasted from the early 1970s until 1989, 16 years of passion, betrayal, departures, and returns. Anjelica once said that when Jack loved, he was gentle. But when Jack feared losing his freedom, he became someone else. A man who wanted to stand at the center of every spotlight. A man who refused to belong to anyone, even the woman he loved most. Anjelica once said, "Jack loves with tenderness, but he lives with fear, and fear always leads people to betray." It wasn't until one explosive event that Hollywood finally saw the other side of their relationship. One day, when Anjelica discovered Jack had fathered a child with another woman, she went straight to the Mulholland Drive mansion, kicked the door open, and punched Jack until the whole house fell silent. Jack stood still. No dodging, no defense. Later, he said only one calm but heavy sentence. "I'm not angry. She had the right to do that." It was one of the rare times people saw Jack's mask of nonchalance fall away. During these years, Jack lived in a strange home on Mulholland Drive, a place Hollywood stars described as the forest of the misfits. The remarkable thing was, Jack never locked his door. Friends, artists, and Hollywood's oddest faces could walk in at any hour. Once, Deborah Winger entered around midnight and joked, "Jack's house doesn't feel like a house. It feels like a train station everyone can pass through." When asked why he didn't lock the door, Jack simply smirked. "I've got nothing to hide. What needs hiding is in my head." A cryptic line, yet one that revealed the essence of who he was. A man who lived impulsively and instinctively, but with a strange clarity in his darkest corners. Amid this personal chaos, Jack stepped into the role that would reshape his entire career. Jack Torrance in The Shining, 1980. Stanley Kubrick wanted a face that could shift from calm to madness in seconds, and no one fit the description better than Nicholson. Behind the scenes, Kubrick shot every scene dozens, even hundreds of times. Some days the crew collapsed from exhaustion, but Jack stayed standing, using every instinct to push the character deeper. The scene where he axes through the door, hair wild, eyes bulging, a smile that looked like it had crawled out of darkness, wasn't just acting. It was the release of everything Jack had held inside. When his character knocks and shouts, "Here's Johnny," it became the symbol of cinematic insanity. but also a moment reflecting a part of Jack long unspoken. Instability, anger with no shelter, the feeling of being trapped in a world that didn't make sense. After the storm of The Shining, Jack surprised everyone with the role of pilot Garrett Breedlove in Terms of Endearment, 1983. Funny, charming, mischievous, and this time, tender enough to touch the audience in a way few believed Jack capable of. That performance earned him his second Oscar, this time for Best Supporting Actor. When he stepped on stage to accept it, Jack looked at the room with a smile that was both grateful and sly. The smile of a man who knew he was playing a game bigger than fame, but had no intention of leaving it. The 1980s ended with a face that would anchor itself in history. Joker in Batman, 1989. Tim Burton wanted a Joker with iconic weight, funny yet terrifying, animated yet hollow. He didn't want a villain. He wanted a soul. Jack needed only one meeting. When Burton described the Joker as a chaos being with his own logic, Jack laughed. "If you're looking for essence, I already have it." Nicholson's Joker became a phenomenon. That eerie smile, the stark white makeup, the long red slash of lips became a mask the entire world could never forget. And when a reporter asked him, "How much of the Joker is the real Jack Nicholson?" he just shrugged. "Joker is just me when I'm being honest." It wasn't a joke. It was a confession whispered lightly, yet enough to reveal a deeper truth. Every mask Nicholson had ever worn, from George Hansen to Bobby Dupay to Jake Giddes to McMurphy, was a separate piece of a man with too many layers, too many shadows to fully articulate. Looking back on this era, Jack seemed like a strange magnet, drawing in the light while also attracting darkness. He stood at the peak of fame, but each role seemed to tear away another mask from his true self. And the closer he came to the truth, the more he realized it was more complicated than any role he had ever played. It was a time when light and darkness blended into one, indistinguishable. And it was also the era when Jack's masks stopped merely hiding him and began becoming his very identity. When the 1990s began, Jack Nicholson found himself in a place unlike any phase before it. No longer haunted by youthful restlessness, no longer swept away by the storms of the 70s and 80s, and no longer blazing in the fiery light of roles that changed the course of cinema. He entered his 50s as a man who understood both his power and his limits, but also realized that the freedom he had chased all his life always carried a price. Loneliness was becoming an inseparable companion. Hollywood had changed. New faces emerged. Young stars shared the spotlight that once belonged only to a few giants. But Jack was never pushed aside. He stood outside every competition like an old mountain. No need to prove, no need to fight. He once laughed and said, "At this age, I don't need directors anymore. I understand myself better than anyone." It wasn't arrogance. It was the acceptance of a man who had lived by instinct, and now understood that instinct was the greatest director of his life. In the early 90s, Jack stepped into roles that were less chaotic but far deeper. In A Few Good Men, 1992, he played Colonel Jessup, a man with a dark truth hidden beneath a facade of iron discipline. His shouted line, "You can't handle the truth," wasn't just a cinematic moment. It was Jack speaking to Hollywood. The truth about him was always more complicated than anyone could handle. Behind the scenes, Tom Cruise said the confrontation scene wasn't shot many times. Jack simply stood there, eyes reddening with restrained fury, and exploded in a single beat, not a centimeter off. Crews said, "He wasn't acting. He was discharging electricity." But alongside these major roles, Jack's personal life sank into a quieter period. The fallout of his separation from Anjelica Huston still lingered, a dull ache stretching across years. 16 years of love, passion, and hurt had left an emptiness in Jack that nothing else could fill. Friends said that some nights, when the house was silent, Jack would step onto the terrace, look at the city lights, and whisper, "No one stays with me long enough to see who I really am." After Anjelica, Jack entered new relationships, but none deep enough to keep him grounded. With Rebecca Broussard, he had 2 children, Lorraine and Raymond. Fatherhood was one of the few roles Jack truly tried to perform with reverence. He always acknowledged his children, attended school meetings, and showed up in ways his career could never prevent. Once, when his daughter Jennifer asked, "Dad, what are you most afraid of?" Jack smiled sadly. "I'm only afraid of not being there when you need me." It was the softest side of a man used to hiding emotion behind a razor-edged smile. Then came Lara Flynn Boyle, a relationship with nearly a 30-year age difference, like a stray reel of film. Lara made Jack feel young again, but the generational gap and the gap between their souls made everything slip away. Despite the jealousy, the chaotic breakups, and reconciliations, the relationship ended. Jack once said, "I'm a lousy lover, but a good father." A line that sounded light, but carried bitterness. The Mulholland Drive house that once buzzed like a train station became a place where he lived alone more often. Still unlocked, but visited less. Friends married, drifted away from long nights. Some passed away, some faded into silence. Jack once admitted, "I fear the moment I walk into my house and don't hear anyone's voice." For a man who once lived at the center of every party, that fear was something he never learned to escape. At work, Jack continued taking on roles with more emotional depth, as if speaking to himself through each character. In As Good as It Gets, 1997, he played an obsessive-compulsive writer, difficult to love, difficult to tolerate, yet desperate for connection. When his character told Helen Hunt, "You make me want to be a better man," audiences cried. And Jack, a man who had lived through countless romances yet never married, stood there as if saying aloud something he had hidden his whole life. The role earned him his 3rd Oscar, and people realized Jack was no longer the face of rebellion. He had become the face of men learning to forgive themselves. Then came About Schmidt, 2002, where Jack stripped away all remaining glamour to portray an elderly man, lost after his wife's death and forced to face how small his life truly was. Audiences could barely believe it was Nicholson. No sly grin, no sharp eyes, no explosive energy. Only weariness, silence, and loneliness so real it couldn't be called acting. Director Alexander Payne said Jack had sent him a letter with only one line: "I want to calm down. I want to try being quiet." A line so gentle it made people realize, after years of chasing freedom and light, Jack was searching for something he had lost long ago: peace. In the early 2000s, Jack still appeared courtside at Lakers games, still laughed loudly in the front row, still the king of Hollywood Boulevard. But when he left the arena, he returned to his huge mansion, where the hallway lights stayed on late, just to chase away the feeling that the house was too empty. And this was the period when Jack confessed the thing he had avoided all his life. Loneliness comes to me like darkness slowly filling up a room. He had lived one part of his life in fire. Now he stepped into a part filled with reflection, contemplation, and countless empty spaces no role could fill. When the final years of the 20th century arrived and the 2000s began, Jack Nicholson started appearing less and less on screen. Not because the offers stopped coming, but because he had climbed enough peaks to understand that even the brightest lights must eventually dim. Hollywood was changing, new stars were rising, but Jack wasn't being left behind. Instead, he withdrew by choice, like a man who had grown too familiar with the spotlight and now wanted to enjoy a bit of quiet darkness reserved only for himself. After The Departed, 2006, where Jack played Frank Costello, one of his last dangerous and explosive characters, he all but closed the curtain on his acting career. That film felt like the final thunderclap of a storm that had lasted more than half a century. At that time, he said softly in a small interview, "I don't want to fade away. When I leave, I want to leave while people still remember me clearly." Entering his 70s, Jack slowed down. The Mulholland Drive house, once the center of every party, was now covered in a new stillness. His closest friends had all left the world. Marlon Brando, Dennis Hopper, Bob Rafelson, the souls who had run wild with him through half a lifetime of rebellion, were now only silhouettes on the walls of memory. Jack bought Brando's old house and had it completely demolished, leaving only the empty land. When asked why, he simply said, "I couldn't bear walking in there and not seeing Marlon sitting in the corner." A gentle sentence, yet heavy with the weight of a man finally admitting that loss is the one thing no mask can hide. Jack's private life during this period became so quiet that many thought he was living in seclusion. Not true. Jack wasn't hiding. He just didn't want to perform anymore, even in real life. Friends said Jack spent long hours in the garden reading, painting, watching the Los Angeles sunset change colors. Once, an old friend asked, "Don't you feel sad that you don't have a new love anymore?" Jack smiled softly. "I've loved enough. I just haven't loved myself enough." A sentence the Jack of the 1970s would never have spoken. Even so, loneliness followed Jack like a shadow. As old age arrived, what he feared most wasn't losing fame or the ability to act, but losing his memory, losing the ability to recognize himself. Rumors swirled that Jack suffered mild memory decline. He never confirmed it. But sometimes he said things that made people suspect he was touching the deepest fear inside him. "I've lived too many lives. If I forget a few of them, it wouldn't be strange." One sparse afternoon, Jack sat watching the sky and said to the only friend present, "I used to fear being seen. Now I fear being forgotten." A man who had worn so many masks all his life, now standing before himself with nowhere left to hide. From 2013 onward, Jack nearly vanished from public life. No red carpets, no interviews, no roles. Only the rare appearances courtside at Lakers games. Silver hair, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, steps slower but carrying the same mischievous smile. The audience would rise and applaud each time he entered the arena, as if witnessing the last flicker of classic Hollywood light. And then, by the late 2010s, even those appearances dwindled. Jack withdrew into Bel Air, into the vast mansion overlooking Los Angeles, the city he once set ablaze. Now the house was quiet as still wind. The hallway lights stayed on all night, not to welcome guests, but to soften the overwhelming emptiness of a space once full of laughter. Though absent from the screen, Jack remained vivid in popular culture. His roles became milestones by which acting is measured. Joker, 1989, remains the standard for madness. Jack Torrance, 1980, remains the definition of fear. McMurphy, 1975, remains the face of freedom. Gittes, 1974, remains the symbol of deception and pain. Schmidt, 2002, remains proof of the loneliness of old age. Jack no longer acts, but his legacy lives on, powerful as if he had just left the set yesterday. The film world still uses his performances to compare, to study, to remind itself that some artists need only appear once to define an entire era. Today, at over 80, Jack Nicholson lives a slow life, quiet, rarely seen, deep in thought. His closest friends say Jack has softened, no longer trying to impress, no longer trying to appear mysterious, simply because he no longer needs to. One evening in his yard, Jack said, "I've worn too many masks. Now I just want to keep one, the one that brings me peace." That sentence closes the long journey of a man who once overwhelmed Hollywood with his multiplicity. A man who once lived too big, now choosing to live small, quieter, slower, to finally hear the sound of his own voice. For nearly 6 decades under the spotlight, Jack Nicholson didn't just leave behind performances that entered cinematic history. He left pieces of his own soul in every face he put on. 12 Oscar nominations, 3 wins, more than 70 films, spanning rebellion, madness, silence, and solitude. And yet, if all those numbers were gathered into a single introduction, they would still be too small compared to what he truly gave cinema. A face that could tell the story of an entire generation, and a gaze capable of exposing the corners of humanity we try hardest to avoid. Jack once said, "I never played heroes because my life was never a heroic one." That is the rawest truth he ever learned to accept. In a world where so many act to be loved, to be praised, to be seen, Jack chose a different path, acting to find himself again, acting to turn pain into art, acting to convince himself that he truly existed in a world too vast for a soul with so many fractures. He wasn't perfect. He never tried to be perfect. He simply lived honestly behind the masks life handed him. The mask of the madman, the villain, the wounded man, the rebel who refused to bow. And it is that imperfection that created a legend American cinema has never seen a second time. As this story closes, let the final image be slow and still. The camera glides past the quiet house in Bel Air, an old armchair, a shining poster on the wall, Jack Torrance's eyes still burning as if the fire never dimmed, and on the corner of the table, an old photograph. Jack, much younger, smiling softly. A smile with no sharpness, no mischief, no performance. Just the smile of a man who finally touched peace after a lifetime of running. The light fades. Only the silhouette of a legend remains. Quiet, steady, and more complete than any role he ever played. There are people who act to be seen. Jack Nicholson acted to believe he existed. If this journey reminds you of someone who once hid their pain behind a smile, perhaps Jack's story will stay with you longer than a moment. And sometimes, with just one slower glance, we finally see the person behind the mask. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the lives behind the fame. This is Hollywood Biographies, the light, the silence, the legacy.